Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood. So architect and urban planner Daniel Burnham, who of course made the plans for Chicago as well, the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, and the major plans for the modern Chicago, declared, supposedly, in 1907. Burnham might have been speaking to Frederick Remington, to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, to Proctor, to Dallin, to Fraser, to a number of artists that I'll talk about today, who thought big and followed up with some of the most iconic sculptures in American history, such as these two, the 1908 monumental cowboy in Philadelphia's Fairmount Park, and the Scout, which you've seen today right here in Cody. This morning, I'll consider the no little plans of American bronze sculptors who worked between 1850 and 1925. It was, I'll argue, a new Bronze Age in which appeared statuettes for an emerging class of collectors and monumental bronzes for the masses that graced grand public spaces sprouting up across the country. I'll focus on the choice of Western American subject matter to understand how Indians, cowboys, and animals unique to North America reinforced a growing nationalism, especially at the turn of the 20th century. But I'll also highlight a number of distinctly non-Western key American works in bronze. We Americans sometimes think that we invented everything, including the internet, and I guess we did. But bronze casting, as you know well, is an ancient art, dating back more than 5,000 years. The American version of bronze casting, creating a copper alloy with small amounts of zinc, lead, and tin, is more recent. Specifically, our tradition dates to 1849, when Henry Kirke Brown cast a 22-inch high statuette, The Choosing of the Arrow, at his newly established foundry in Brooklyn. The cast, which was of sand casting technique, as you've just heard that, the difference between sand, I'll talk a little bit more about that, between sand and lost wax. The cast on the left is in the Metropolitan Museum's collection, and on the right at the Whitney, right here, at Buffalo Bill, and you can see it upstairs in the gallery. Brown made his sculpture on commission from the American Art Union, the most important art organization in the middle years of the 19th century. The Art Union wanted 20 statuettes of a figure, quote, illustrative of Indian form and character, to distribute by lottery, as they did the collections that they put together every year, to its members. Brown responded to the Art Union's call because, like that institution's managers, he believed in the value of American subject matter and in the efficacy of small bronzes like this to make sculpture affordable for the middle class, to bring art into the home. For this commission, Brown spent a month on Mackinac Island in northern Michigan to study Native people there. Yet the statuette he created looked more to classical Italy, I think you would agree, than to Native America. Specifically, it recalls various sculptures of Apollo, notably these 2nd century marbles. Discovered during the Renaissance, especially on the right, the much admired Apollo Belvedere, itself a Roman marble copy of a lost Greek bronze original, was judged the benchmark for masculine beauty in the 18th and 19th centuries. Brown probably saw it during his 4-year stay in Italy. Like the ancient sculptors, Brown posed his figure in contrapposto. The man shifts his weight from left foot to right foot, while his right arm reaches back to grasp an arrow, and his lowered left hand holds a bow. Balanced, graceful, beautiful, with a classical profile respectful of the ancient model, this native seems far from native. But perhaps only his bow and arrow, we might associate that, although it could be an ancient god with a bow and arrow, but his ornamental top knot, which scholars have argued about, and I think we've come to the conclusion that, yes, indeed, the Indians that he studied did dress their hair in this particular way. So that top knot might or might not have been recognizable to those who saw the work in New York or acquired it by lottery, but it did indeed identify this man as native. In many ways, Brown's sculpture fits well into the long history of bronzes in which the human figure in isolation is the most common subject. That figure is usually standing, check, usually nude, check, and yes, usually male, check. Brown did veer from the favored American marble subject. Marble had been the chosen material for sculptors for the most part before this time, and that was the female figure, seen here in Hiram Powers' marble, the Greek slave of 1843. Separate viewing times for men and women to gaze upon the Greek slave were established on parts of its extensive American tour. Yet the subject, a shackled slave whose Christian beliefs were on view, and you can see here there is a cross as part of the drapery that she has been, we understand, forced to remove. All of these things protected her somewhat from the scandal of nudity. I should add, too, that few viewers miss the connection between the ostensible subject of Greek slavery and the growing crisis over American slavery. Yet even the favored style and its connection to the past, specifically to Apollo, which many would have recognized, didn't shield choosing of the arrow from controversy in 1850s America. The first problem was male nudity, which some felt not proper for female eyes. It was one thing to imagine this statuette in the library of a man, but it was another to imagine it in the parlor where women and children would see it. The art union, ever ready, tried to solve this problem by outfitting the statuette. Can you see the difference here? Yes, with a fig leaf. Well, I don't know if each one came with a fig leaf, but fig leaves were available, maybe as an option, but certainly you could get a fig leaf. So it seems there was discussion about this, how to handle this controversy. But you'll be perhaps interested to know the fig leaf is removable. Of the 9 statuettes known to have survived, there were 20, as I mentioned. Maybe more will turn up. Karen was hoping maybe Antiques Roadshow. They're not signed. They have no cast numbers or anything on them. So keep your eye open. There should be more. Of the 9, only 2 that I know of retained their fig leaves. Now, I haven't examined all of them carefully enough to see if they're all drilled for, but these 2 at least are drilled. This cast is now at the Amon Carter Museum, which chooses to show, at least maybe Andrew can confirm this, still with its fig leaf. The Metropolitan chooses to exhibit it without the fig leaf. Now, I'll leave you that to discuss. But there was, too, a racial dimension to this sculpture. One journalist observed in 1850, quote, "The bronze is so near to the natural copper of the skin that there is nothing to modify the complete disgust with which its undisguised nakedness," I guess he was talking without the fig leaf, "must be looked upon." In future, loincloths and buffalo robes, for the most part, hid the nakedness of male Indians. I went too far. Stay. Okay. Not only is the 1860 Indian Hunter by John Quincy Adams Ward well covered, he leans over rather than stands erect. And this is the isolated figure standing erect is the more typical of in the history of bronzes. Yet Ward, like Brown, relied on an ancient prototype. Here, it's the Borghese Warrior in the collection of the Louvre. I don't know whether Ward saw a copy or saw the Borghese Warrior itself, the marble, but he had a small copy of the sculpture in his own studio, so we know he was looking at it. Some 1860 viewers admired the way Ward's figure moved away from the high classical style of choosing of the arrow. One critic judged that, quote, "his face, which is of the pure Indian type, is subdued to no fancy requirement of this classic ideal." Further, he was, quote, an animal, fierce and instinctive as the dog by his side. In these words, we hear admiration, yes, mixed with a great deal of racial prejudice. What's clear from the history of bronze sculpture in America is that by 1860, naturalism, often called realism, had overtaken neoclassicism as the favored style. And we see that here. The Ward is more naturalistic than the more directly neoclassical Brown. We also see a change from an isolated figure to one embedded in a narrative. Ward's Indian and his dog are acutely aware of something beyond our view, something outside of the sculpture itself, while Brown's Indian is self-contained. In the years after the Civil War, following the war's hiatus of fine arts casting in bronze, of course there was no fine arts casting during the war, sculptors and their patrons succeeded in placing monumental bronzes in new public spaces, which were springing up, especially in urban centers. One of these spaces, of course, was Central Park, where by 1869, a group of Ward's supporters had raised funds to have the Indian hunter cast in large scale and installed there. It was the first sculpture by an American artist in the park. Look carefully to see the differences between the statuette and the monument. In the large-scale sculpture, not only does the man's closed hand restrain a fiercer dog, but also the face of the hunter is more mature and more phenotypically native than in the earlier statuette. This might be explained by Ward's travel to study Indians in Dakota Territory between the making of the models for the two versions. Perhaps, too, he wanted a more dramatic narrative for the outdoor setting than he had imagined for a domestically scaled, a more polite, we might say, statuette. In fact, by 1903, a leading US sculptor and sculpture historian, Laredo Taft, judged the experience of seeing the life-size cast of the Indian hunter to be superior to that of the statuette, because outdoors, he claimed, quote, one might wonder if this is a real Indian. In the park, he was, quote, a sudden apparition, low bent amid the foliage. His copper glow, his preoccupation, his silence makes the illusion complete. It is a glimpse of a forgotten past. We could almost imagine, then, the Indian inhabiting the space before the arrival of whites. This historian likely would have found it odd to see Ward's Indian hunter and his dog atop a clock that I desperately want, suited for a parlor mantel. It could be most anywhere. By the turn of the century, Americans might have agreed that Indians lived only in the past, on the mantel, in the park, or in the museum. In historicizing natives, they chose the Indian as a symbol of America's past, not just native past. We can see that here in a proposed monument, the National American Indian Memorial. Indians, some influential white men thought, were idealized ancestors for leaders of a country who felt threatened by a swelling immigrant population. It's telling that this 1912 memorial was to be at the entrance to New York Harbor. Imagine if it had been built. Already then, of course, graced by Lady Liberty. Their proposal read in part that at the monument's pinnacle, you can see it here, would be a, quote, mammoth bronze figure of the North American Indian upon the highest hill crest in the harbor as a witness to the passing race of the passing race to all the nations of the world as they come to our shores. Race entwined in American history was a prominent theme at the turn of the century, to the 20th century, which John Quincy Adams Ward had anticipated in The Indian Hunter of 1860 and The Freedman, there it is, of 1863. In each of these casts, both in the Amon Carter collection and one of which in particular Andrew Walker has published very astutely on, a bent figure of a man raises his head to look at something we can't see, which embeds us within its narrative, one of hunting, the other of escape. With the freedmen, Ward paid homage to Lincoln's emancipation, which, as we know, freed only slaves in the Confederate States. As one scholar put it, it declared the enemy's slaves free and kept its own in bondage. Ward then shows what his contemporaries would have understood to be a Southern slave, holding a broken chain in his right hand, while a manacle still binds his left wrist. He twists his torso and raises his head to look up. His face is ethnographically naturalistic, and his almost nude, muscled body gains heroic association by its resemblance to the first-century Roman Belvedere torso. Most important is his action. He has freed himself. It is almost as if he's between slavery and freedom. It was to the first representation of an African American in bronze. Ward's supporters weren't successful in raising funds to transform this extraordinary statuette into a monumental work. We can imagine how this might have changed some of the narrative, perhaps, in Washington. Many thought it should be installed in the United States Capitol, along with the marble Horatio Greeno of George Washington. And it wasn't until the latter decades of the 19th century that local communities found a way to commemorate the war with individual statues of standing soldiers. A white Civil War soldier cast into bronze was ubiquitous in later 19th century American public spaces and cemeteries. John Quincy Adams Ward's monument, here you see it, to the 7th Regiment, dedicated in 1874 in Central Park, is the best known of what would become thousands of ready-made bronze figures and with stone bases, not specifically and site designed as this one was, that the monument industry sold to large cities and small towns across America. The pose of these citizen infantrymen is usually at parade rest, with one leg bent in a relaxed contrapposto, hands holding a rifle, which carries some of the soldiers' weight. Weariness, dedication, all there. You see them so often. You might see this here. There it is. In urban New York City or rural Salem, New York, that they are almost invisible, part of an expected landscape of commemoration. With a tweak of uniform, Union and Confederate soldiers could be almost interchangeable. New York, Florida, and West Virginia here. This was possible because each man conveys duty rather than the justice of a cause. We don't know what the cause is from the sculpture. They could not, however, be black because a black soldier represented the Union cause, emancipation rather than generic service. By 1900, though, a monumental bronze relief confirmed the public role of race in the Civil War and so in American history. Augusta Saint-Gaudens' Shaw Memorial, still in its original spot atop Boston's Beacon Hill, shows the moment Robert Gould Shaw mustered an all-black regiment, which he led into an ill-fated battle, where Shaw and many others of his men died. Here the white man rides beside, but above the marching black men. Yet the power that Saint-Gaudens instilled in the bodies and faces of these foot soldiers reveals a will to free others of their race. Nearly 200,000 black men served in the Union Army. The memorialization of the Civil War continued past the First World War, notably in the 1922 dedication of Henry Shreddies' monument to Ulysses S. Grant, directly in front of the United States Capitol. Although astride his horse, you see the monument there, and above the fray, so to speak, and surrounded by 4 heraldic lions, which have their genesis in Trafalgar Square. There's a story there that I should know more about. Grant, as you can see from his face, which you look up to if you're below the monument, it's the only way to do it, unless you are climb up on it, which is discouraged. He's hunkered down and scowling, hardly the image of the winning general of the Civil War. More extraordinary still is one of the two groups at either side of the mounted figure and at our eye level. This one is the cavalry group. It portrays chaos and the impending death of a soldier. You can see his face right here. His horse, he has fallen from beneath his horse and soon to be crushed by his charging comrades, some of whose faces express awareness of his fate. It defies the simple presentation of the dutiful standing soldier, complicating the story of the war in the heart of the nation's capital and in front of the Capitol itself. Shreddies Grant has become, at least to television watchers, more prominent, perhaps even notorious recently. It appears 7 times, count them, in the opening credits to House of Cards, each of the 5 seasons. I guess we should be ready for something horrible to happen at the base of Shreddies Grant. But I've gotten a little ahead of my story, in part because the Grant Memorial took 2 decades to complete. So I go back to the turn of the century. By 1900, bronze sculpture had attained a high position within American sculpture. It had usurped marble sculpture. Few artists were as skilled to exploit that position of bronze sculpture as Frederick Remington, who modestly declared, "I am to endure in bronze." But he was right. His Bronco buster, wildly popular after its first casting in 1895, I think there are 154 something, Peter? A lot of authorized casts and probably triple that number of unauthorized casts just of the Bronco buster. Its first casting in 1895. It may be the best known American sculpture. There should be a poll. That would be interesting to do. Yet, like reimagining the Indian as an American ancestor, the cowboy, Remington's cowboys, were also symbols of a passing way of life. Quote, "The grim pioneer of his race, the cowboy prepares the way for civilization, from before whose face he must disappear," wrote Teddy Roosevelt in 1888. Those who purchased Remington's tabletop bronzes of cowboys likely didn't see him as Roosevelt's grim pioneer of his race, but rather as an exuberant symbol of masculine freedom embodied in the American West, and yes, in the history of America. Purchase it they did, encouraging multiple casts of his small sculptures and bolstering Remington's finances. They sold well. Beginning about 1900, Remington moved away from the standard sand casting bronze technique and the Henry Bonnard foundry to take advantage of an ancient bronze casting method, which experienced a European revival in the 19th century. Ricardo Bertelli, who hailed from Italy, pioneered and dominated in America this method of casting in bronze called lost wax. And it meant, it's a complicated process. There are some really good online videos. The Victorian Albert Museum has a terrific one. There's also a video here in the Proctor installation and others that you can look at that shows the way in which the armatures are made, the plaster casts, and the gelatin, the pliable gelatin molds are made, and then wax covered and then heated, bronze poured. Where there was wax, there will be bronze. That's why it's called lost wax. The technique enabled Remington, who moved his business from Bertelli's Roman bronze works, which was just outside New York City, to realize his sculptural goals of clear, dramatic action, united with greater surface texture and detail than he felt he could achieve with sand casting. This was because lost wax used a malleable gelatin rather than rigid sand molds, and because he could make changes in the fresh wax model necessarily created for each casting, because the wax was lost. Here's an example of the difference. Sand cast by Bonnard on the left, and Lost Wax, cast by Roman bronze works on the right, both in the Amon Carter Museum collection. However cast, and whether working as here taming a wild horse or playing, coming through the rye and painting up the town, this is Princeton's cast, or riding through a blizzard, the extraordinarily beautiful Gilcrease cast, the cowboy was an enduring American character whose 1908 appearance in monumental form in Philadelphia's Fairmount Park was as symbolically important as Ward's Indian hunter was in Central Park 40 years before. Dedicated a year before his death, the cowboy is Remington's only monumental and only site-specific sculpture. Lest you think that all American sculpture veered toward the iconic and the monumental, as embodied by Remington's cowboy, I contrast that large masculine form with a small feminine one, the sometimes maligned Louis Potter's The Basket Weavers of 1905. Today, Potter is as obscure as Remington is revered. But I hope you'll be interested in the basket weavers. I am. It upends our expectation of early 20th century American bronzes, for the most part, because one, it's quiet and contained, its action not easily read. There's no animal to control or whiff of violence. Perhaps most obvious, it features women doing something that looks humble rather than daring. And although these are native women, they're Tlingit in Alaska, not from the upper Midwest or the Great Plains, which most sculptors at the time favored. This is the only cast I know of the work. Maybe someone here can correct me, now in the Gilcrease collection. A photograph in Potter's papers may have been an aide-memoire to something he had seen. He was there, he was in Sitka, or perhaps his only inspiration. It's hard to know. Yet the sculptor chose to show the women in his bronze making rather than selling baskets. And here is a detail which, I'm not going to bring you in all the evidence, but an early photograph shows this woman with a reed in between her fingers up to her teeth, which is how women was recorded at the time in basket magazines and at Smithsonian, was how this was made. So this is the making of baskets. He chose us to show the making rather than selling baskets. The women in the photograph are selling by the side by a fence here of baskets they have clearly made, because some are unfinished. And instead of dressing them in anglicized clothing, as you see in the photograph, he puts his bronzed women into simple robes, perhaps reminiscent of their traditional button blankets. We know the identity of two of the women in the photograph. Mrs. Jim Jacobs is at center, and Mrs. Billy Williams is at right. While we might first assume, as I did and published incorrectly, that the women were married to Anglos, Jim Jacobs and Billy Williams, they were in fact Tlingit elders. The photograph then shows the modern complex world that Potter encountered in Sitka in 1904. Of women dressed in non-traditional clothes, married to Tlingit men with Anglo-sounding names, and of a modern market for baskets. In contrast, Potter's sculpture shows traditionally dressed women making rather than marketing their baskets. Bound into this small sculpture is Potter's desire to shed his role as an Alaskan tourist in order to plunge his viewers back into time to a world of Indian handcraft untainted by the desire of collectors. Collectors of baskets, he hoped. I think the desire of collectors of small bronzes would still be there. Gorham, the first firm that cast the bronze in sandcast, featured it in a book with other Potter bronzes called The Soul of Alaska. There, Gorham marketed Potter as someone with authentic experience. Quote, Mr. Potter, Gorham asserted, has not taken a mere surfaced view of the life he has depicted in imperishable bronze. He has lived with these people. Well, that's somewhat of an exaggeration. He has listened to the aged crones as they have crooned out to him the half-forgotten stories of their tribes. Yet while potter's Tlingit women veer from the usual subject of early 20th century bronzes, in the claim reinforced by his foundry that his experience was authentic, and in his decision to create a scene that appears to be from the past rather than the present, he sustained the approach of his fellow sculptors, that imperishable bronze should represent a truth that was anything but ephemeral. These bronze Indians and cowboys embodied America's past, a past their makers and contemporaries believed that progress, a favored word of the time, would push aside. But sculptors also chose animals that fit this bill, and you've seen him, this handsome guy, before. Primary among them was the North American bison. By 1911, when the city of Washington, D.C. commissioned Alexander Finster Proctor to create 4 monumental bronze bison to grace the Q Street Bridge, there they still are, in the nation's capital, the sculptor had to travel to a Canadian bison preserve, as you heard, to study the beast. And speaking of studies, the Buffalo Bill Center has one of Proctor's plaster studies for this project on view, and you can see it upstairs. No creature had, quote, vanished more dramatically than the North American bison, an animal that had sustained native populations for centuries. By the 1880s, and you see here some of the evidence of its destruction, had been reduced by commercial and government-approved U.S. Army hunting, among other reasons, to just a few hundred. Nothing signaled to late 19th century Americans the loss of a species better than the bison. Proctor's 4, there are 2 different, they're as a pair. The bison, this is the one that reaches out with its right leg. The other 2 reach out with their left leg. So there's very wonderful variation there. But these creatures transported to the nation's capital to guard a bridge may have been symbols of hopeful species regeneration, as former President Teddy Roosevelt had called for. Yet to me, they seem to challenge a government that encouraged their decimation. It was private capital, as you well know, through organizations such as the Boone and Crockett Club and the American Bison Society, that reinvigorated the herds in the United States. Not surprisingly, here it comes, tabletop versions of Proctor's buffalo were popular items for the home, taking their place in urban parlors beside the Indian and the cowboy as memories of an American past. The bison on the top is here at the Buffalo Bill Center, the lower one in the Colby College, you see them from both sides, in the Colby College collection. Sculpted Indians sometimes enacted the history of their own decline. Appeal to the Great Spirit is one of 4 monumental bronzes Cyrus Dallin planned to tell what he called, quote, the history of the relations between white and red men. That sounds very non-committal, doesn't it? He named the series The Epic of the Indian. You saw one of the other ones, The Signal of Peace in Chicago. Dallin's inspiration was international. He had seen show Indians, as they were called, perform in 1889 in Buffalo Bill's Wild West in Paris. 20 years later, he ended the series with this appeal to the Great Spirit. Arms outstretched and head thrown back, Dallin's horseman turns his back on the world of the white man to entrust his future, that unknown future, to an unseen spirit. He has, in effect, given up resistance in this world to seek sustenance in a spiritual one. In 1909, a critic dismissed Dallin's Indian as a member of a race soon to be as extinct as the dodo or the mastodon. Lovely. We know it wasn't true. And also, by 1922, 4 show Indians paid a visit to the sculpture installed in front of the courtyard of Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, where it remains today. Bald eagle, you can see him here on the left, wearing a bonnet, which is not unlike the one worn by the bronze Indian. You can see it here. This clearly was a photo op. I don't think they used that term then, likely arranged by the circus that had hired the Indians to perform in a Wild West show then being staged in Boston. Can we even imagine, though, what these native performers thought as they rode down Huntington Avenue amid electric streetcars altogether new, one of the first in the nation, and automobiles from the State House, the Boston State House, whose steps they had ridden up to greet the governor, here, to the Art Museum, from a site of white political power to one of equally white cultural power. It's really hard to imagine getting into their heads. Was it just part of the contract? Was this part of what they had to do to get paid? Or did they see strength in a monumental bronze of an Indian rejecting this world in favor of the next? Dallin began his sculpture as a monumental work. He had modeled it earlier in a small version, but the monument was the first to be cast. But he subsequently modeled and had it cast in tabletop size. This particular cast, seen from both sides, is in a private collection. James Earle Fraser envisioned the end of the trail as a monument for the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, where it was made of staff, as Peter mentioned, a mixture of plaster of Paris, horsehair, cloth fibers, straw, whatever, not a permanent material, but outside, over a steel frame. The monumental piece is now very well restored at the Cowboy Hall of Fame in the Cowboy Center in Oklahoma City. Although Fraser and Dallin each represented a cultural end, the defeated mood of Fraser's sculpture is distinctly different from that of Dallin's more spiritual strength. It's difficult to imagine natives coming to pay tribute to the end of the trail. Instead of sitting upright on an alert steed, looking to a higher power for strength, Fraser's Indian is slumped in exhaustion, as beaten down as his horse. Fraser's inspiration for this sculpture came in part from his own experience growing up in Dakota Territory, where he recounted he would often hear old trappers, quote, speak about the Indians and where they would end up. The trappers, Fraser wrote, quote, all thought that would be in the Pacific Ocean. So here at the western edge of the continent, Fraser envisioned such an ending. The exposition's catalog identified Fraser's Indian as, quote, a reminiscence of early American history and his traditions of courage and endurance and the pathos of the Indians' decline, clearly linking the root of white America's courage in the Indians' endurance and inevitable, as they saw it, demise. Fraser's statuettes, cast a few years after the monumental bronze, proved to be very popular. This is the Metropolitan Museum's cast. It's easy to understand that those who purchased the work and those who wrote about it had conflicting views of its meaning. That is what art is about, how meaning is constructed differently by viewers at the same time or over time. Then, some saw it as an indictment of, quote, the nation's stupidity that has generally and cruelly destroyed a race of people possessing imagination, integrity, fidelity, and nobility, while others regarded the Indian's end as necessary to the white man's progress, that word again. I think the sculpture made space for such divergent responses because what it conveys most forcefully is more fundamental than either. The official guide to the exposition proposed that, quote, the work may be interpreted merely as a picture of physical exhaustion. I'm not quite sure what they were meaning then, like, don't take it as an Indian? I don't know. But I think it is even more an embodiment of suffering. A muscular, well-formed man slumps on a horse that barely stands against the east wind driving them and what they represented, I think we are to understand, into history. Fraser, too, as you've seen this before, designed the Indian head and the squished buffalo onto a nickel, first cast at the U.S. Treasury in 1913. Two sides of the same coin, both viewed as endangered species in the early years of the 20th century. More usual were sculptures portraying the romance of the West. Even oh, I think actually, I wanted to show you here this. I think it is fair to say that Dallin and Fraser are unusual in representing the Indian in decline. Not exclusive, they aren't exclusive to this. But effectively, I think what's important is they're indicating the passage of time in Native history. Native history, of course, seen from a white perspective. Neither sculpture shows the actual condition of Native life, but each symbolically represents what they saw as the end of a way of life, whether that is mourned, as I think it is here by both of these sculptors, not by all Americans, white Americans. More usual were sculptures portraying the romance of the West. Even in this small 1905 Buffalo Hunt, this cast in the Amon Carter Museum, Charlie Russell captures the romantic excitement of the West. The Buffalo Hunt was Russell's most frequent subject in all of his mediums, yet he never saw one. His knowledge came instead from historical accounts, from the work of earlier artists, some of whom had seen them, from conversations with Indians who remembered such hunts, and from his own participation in bison roundups. To have this sculpture cast, Russell had to leave the West, to take his wax models to New York City, a place that appealed to his promotional wife, Nancy, more than it did to Charlie. But he did it, and he had them cast. Unlike the 1876 statuette by Theodore Bauer, which appeared at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, with its rearing horse and single dying bison decoratively contained on a base and cast in silvered electrotype, Russell's exuberant sculpture threatens to veer off its support. The bison lurch, the pony scrambles, the hunter strains to keep his seat. Everything is in motion, like the Hollywood movies that Russell came to love. Buffalo Hunt statuettes bracket Russell's sculpture career. This late one from 1924, called Meat for Wild Men, ratchets up the action. Two mounted hunters close in on a dozen frenzied bison they have chased into a mass to make their killing easier. It was a known technique. Crushed animals pile up and appear to bellow in pain. But this isn't hunting for sport. The Indian, as Russell knew, and his title, Meat for Wild Men, affirmed, used every part of the beast to sustain his life, a life that considered vanishing, now embalmed in bronze. When Russell created Meat for Wild Men, another sculptor envisioned a very different Indian hunter. In 1925, for a commission as a fountain centerpiece in a park in St. Paul, Minnesota, Paul Manship created a stylized Indian hunter and his dog. Manship's Indian is buoyant, even playful. He's even surrounded here by some geese who spurt water. His dog, a wonderful dog, leaps forward in synchrony, it's like a ballet, with its human companion's backward kick. Manship knew little, as far as I know, of Indian ways, and I'll wager he didn't care about Indian history as Russell did. Instead, his interest was in finding American figures to carry the power of the ancient sculpture he admired. I want to finish up with my favorite Manship sculpture, actually a pair of sculptures that he first made for himself in 1914. He modeled then Indian hunter, two separate bronzes, Indian hunter and pronghorn antelope, for two empty pedestals on either side of the mantelpiece in his New York City apartment. They're empty, he said. We need something. These casts are at the Amon Carter. You'll recognize Manship's style from the later Indian hunter and his dog, which I've just shown you, as indebted to archaic sculpture with broad forms articulated by crisp lines, which allied these works to international Art Deco, a style that fully emerged a decade later in Paris, officially at the exposition in 1925. Manship designed this pair in the round, yet he intended them to be seen in profile. They were up against a mantel, and to enact a narrative read from left to right. The silhouetted figures are frozen at the moment the arrow finds its mark in the beast's side. Here. One influential collector, and you've seen him, Herbert Pratt, Seeing the potential of Manship's sculpture as garden ornaments, commissioned monumental versions for his summer estate in Glen Cove, New York. He was, as Peter mentioned, the chairman. He was one of 6 brothers, and all of them were leaders, titans of industry, as they say, and he followed his father, who had one of the founders of Standard Oil, to be the chairman. His estate, and the 6 brothers all had houses together on a large piece of property in Glen Cove, and a substantial estate. This was just Herbert's house. They didn't share this house. This wasn't an apartment. It was his house. A substantial estate, on the grounds of which Pratt installed the pair. And you'll forgive me here because I found this, this photograph, and we never knew where they were exactly. Here they are, monumental, right there. They were installed 60 feet apart, if I'm figuring how big they are and how far apart, against trees that towered 40 feet above them. Interesting to think about this experience. Of course, it was a private experience. You didn't just wander into the garden. You were invited by the Pratts. And unlike, I think, the fitness of John Quincy Adams Ward's, at least as it was seen, naturalistic Indian hunter and his dog, judged, you'll remember, a sudden apparition, low bent among the foliage of Central Park, Manship disliked his enlarged pair of sculptures out of doors. Quote, "It was contrived to appear natural, which of course it isn't," he's reported to have said. The group was really a rather artificial mantle ornament. I think that Manship's dismay may have been somewhat lifted by the extremely high price of $15,000 that Pratt offered him. He said, Manship said, "Well, I don't want to do it." And Pratt said, "For $15,000, he said, "Okay." So he needed the money, he did it. It's difficult to see the scale of this garden pair, either from installed there or when you see just slides of it, digital slides of it like this. Which Herbert Pratt gave with an enormously fabulous collection of American works to his alma mater, Amherst College. In the gallery of the college's art museum, you get a better idea of their scale and presence, although they're so large, and the gallery where they have most recently been installed, so small that they couldn't install them properly. Now the Indian's shooting you as you come. He's supposed to be shooting the Indian. So, I mean, the antelope. At any rate, you get the idea now of their scale, of how large. I should have posed somebody beside that, but there they are. We read the narrative, so you won't be shot, I'll put them this way, from left to right. In fact, we enter the story after the Indian has shot an arrow, which has struck the pronghorn in its right shoulder. The space, this is really important, the space between the two implies the passage of time, which is charged. It's a charged space with the memory of the flight of the arrow. Part of the drama comes from the almost life-sized figures, part from the intense focus of the Indian, whose gaze follows the path of his arrow, and part from the impending death, we know it's coming, of the animal he has shot. Looking at sculpture in digital form, remember that these are three-dimensional works, large or small, inhabiting the same space that we do. That is the difference between sculpture and painting, whereas we inhabit the space, especially if it's installed in such a way that we can move around it, but even if we can't. Here, muscles are everywhere. The beast's strength is evident in its fight for life, and every inch of the hunter's beautiful body is flexed. The Indian is nude, but for a loincloth, not to worry, and the skin of a large cat draped over his left knee. As strong, unbowed, and as fully in control of his environment as the Indian hunter appears to be, we have to remember he's dependent on the survival of the animal he hunts. At the time Manship made this sculpture, the pronghorn, a species unique to North America, was deemed to be one of the first big game animals at risk of extinction. The Pratts were also big game hunters themselves, George more than Herbert. The pronghorn was worthy then, and the attempt had been made to preserve it in the New York Zoological Park, the newly established Zoological Park in the Bronx, where it didn't thrive in captivity. They died. Did Manship choose the pronghorn over the bison because of recent attention to the creature, or because its sharp, graceful lines fulfilled his artistic need better than the shaggy, lumbering bison? It's hard to know, but I somehow think both might be involved. Although Indians were unusual subjects for manship who leaned more toward the classical mythological subject, we see that he gave them and the animals they hunted or hunted with, such as the dog, dramatic roles in his new American mythology. They are, however, quite unlike the other Western subjects in bronze we've looked at this morning. In fact, I'm not sure we can call them Western at all. With manship, we are far from the nationalistic and racial context of all the others, from Henry Kirke Brown to Charlie Russell. In part, this is because by 1925, the nation had changed, a political pivot toward Europe and engagement in a world war. The war, of course, stopped fine arts casting in bronze, as the Civil War had done, which in fact continued mostly to decline in the United States. Manship's bronzes were outliers, really, and there are others. And it wasn't until the 1970s that American sculptors turned in larger numbers regularly to casting in bronze. The new Bronze Age, as I've defined it today, was over. Thank you.